back to another episode of the Stock Shot Show. Now, today we are going through, when we are going through all this stuff, we are working from the ground up because, listen, quite frankly, there is a lot of tips out on the internet, from YouTube to Facebook to Instagram, but the truth of the matter is we want to take this opportunity inside the Stock Shot Show to basically give you a systematic approach so that you know what it is that you need to be doing from the ground up, right? So that you almost have like a checks and balances system so that when you're hitting it bad, you could go, okay, I'm gonna start with my alignment, then I'm gonna go to my grip, then I'm gonna go to my posture, which is what we're gonna talk about today. And let's think about it, right? Like if we go over to a different sport, let's just say the NFL, and we have an offensive lineman, and we have an offensive lineman that is learning how to get in a three-point stance, and they can't get in a balanced three-point stance. They have no chance of blocking that defender, and vice versa. The defender, if they can't be in a balanced three-point stance, getting off the line to basically rush the quarterback, they have no chance. So the foundation, the setup, posture is paramount to giving you a fighting chance to hit a stock shot. And it's probably one of the most overlooked aspects of the entire golf swing, which is why I want to talk about it right now. Now, first and foremost, you essentially have two tilts, right? You have a side tilt, which is this way, and you have a bending over tilt this way. The long and short of it is that when we are bending over from towards the ground, we want to have our spine at about a 45-degree angle, right? So if you were drawing a line from the back of your tailbone up your back, we want that to be between about 45 and 51 degrees. When we're talking about side bend, we want to have that about 5 to 10 degrees, 5 to 12 degrees, right? So, and there's reasons why. So first and foremost, let's talk about why it is important to bend over at the hips at a 45-degree angle. Because quite frankly, when you've heard me maybe say this before, that your brain dictates your body, and your body dictates the club, and the club dictates the ball, and the ball dictates your score, right? So if I were to set up, and this is kind of how I learned when I was a player, if I were to set up like this, and let's just say I was really bent over, what would that do to how the orientation of how the club would go back? Well, if I was bent over like so, the club would have a lot better time, or a lot easier time, staying outside my hands. Vice versa, if I was like this and my upper body was very like up and down, very erect, the club would work way more inside, right? And most people do not bend over properly or hip hinge properly in their setup, right? Now, so the way that we bend over allows us to essentially get this club to work on plane in our backswing. That's the first point. That's why bending over the correct amount is paramount to basically hitting a stock shot. The second one is, let's think about posture, right? Or I'm sorry, side bend this way. So if I think about every other sport in the world, from football, right? If you look at Patrick Mahomes, he's getting ready to throw a big bomb. He takes his drop back, he goes like this, and you can see he has tilt in his body, right? Or Aaron Rodgers, or you think about a pitcher, they go like this and they tilt their spine. And that tilting of their spine is basically a loaded position to dominate and create a ton of force and speed onto the athletic motion of whatever it is that they are doing, right? So that is why when we are taking it back, or when we're setting up, we want to have a little bit of side tilt. Now, what about just posture in regards to, you hear a lot of people talk about this word of pelvic tilting, aka twerking, right? So twerking, if you can learn how to twerk, it's actually a really good skill to learn how to set up to a golf ball, and there's a reason why. Most players, when they set up, is they really arch their lower back, right? So what this does is it basically takes your vertebrae, and in your vertebrae there's like these gel packs, right? And when you basically round out, or like you hear the golf pros say, like, stick your butt out, that's terrible advice. Like, if you see that one, swipe and do not watch that one. Because what's happening is when you do that, you're essentially taking your vertebrae and you're crunching it together, and then you're turning upon it. So what happens is, as the amateur golfer sets up like this, right, and they're arching their lower back, then they don't have tilt and they go back, they have this really bad, like, rolling in their lower back, which makes it why they have a ton of lower back pain. So aside from you just getting better at golf, if you feel like when you go play golf that you have lower back pain and you're like, man, I need to take an Advil, or I need to have like a transfusion or something to take away the pain, this episode is going to help you get rid of having to do that, right? So how do we work on getting it so that we can essentially coach ourselves or look at it so that when you are practicing, you know you are actually doing it correctly? Well, the first and foremost, let's talk about the amount of bend over and bend to the side, and then we'll get into the pelvic tilt, right? So as I'm bending over, right, and I'm setting up, and I were to put this like against my thighs, and I'm bending over at the waist with my legs straight. As I bend over, if I were putting this club down the top of my, essentially down the top of my shirt, right, and bending over, you can see that the club would come out the back side, right? That essentially is going to be illustrating what that 45-degree angle is. Then if I were to bend my knees and I were to essentially take a line, if you were drawing it on video, or we do this like for our members inside Stock Shot Club, and you were to take a line from the back of your tailbone to the top of your knee, to the back of your heel, that number should be about 128 degrees, right? 125 to 130. So that would be the correct amount of knee bend with the correct amount of bending over from the waist, right? Now, the second piece to that is the amount of side bend, right? So if I was setting up and I was essentially could get in my posture to where as I took it back, or when I was in my setup and I took my trail hand and I just ran it down to my knee, that would give me the right amount of what I need for the tilt away from the target. And like we said, all athletic motions have that, right? Like throwing a quarterback, or like even if you look at like Serena Williams and she's serving a tennis ball, right? They all have tilts, right? So we want to have this thing bent over at 45 to 50 degrees. We want to have this thing tilted away at 5 to 10, right? And I can check it by putting my hand on the right side of my leg, and my weight is going to be about 55% into my lead foot and 45% into my back. And we'll get into why that is important when we go into the starting of the backswing, right? So this allows us to get into a setup. Now, what about that pelvic tilt? How do we get rid of back pain? Well, the way that you want to do it, there's a lot of ways that we talked about twerking, right? So if I took my dowel rod and I went like this, you can see that as I fix my arms to the pole, right, I can roll my tail back and then roll it underneath. So this is me basically pelvic tilting to learn how to take my tail and roll it under. And this is going to give you a ton of mobility in your lower back so that now you have the freedom to actually turn in your backswing, which will allow us to create depth and do all those things that we're wanting to do when we get into that backswing, those backswing modules of how to build that backswing, right? So when you're trying to do this, the way you could practice it, if you didn't have a dowel rod, is just simply take a club, right? And you're going to hold it right back here so it's against your thigh, or against the upper part of your lower back, and then against your neck, right? Now from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stand really tall with my legs straight. I'm going to bend over at the waist, break my knees, and then I'm going to pelvic tilt so that I take all of the gap out of this space between it. We should not be able to put our hand between the shaft and our back, right? We don't want this rolling out so we could put the shaft in it. We want this thing to be flat. And what that does is essentially allows our spine to elongate and allows us to turn in our hips and our pelvis and all these things, right? Just to basically work effectively, right? So we're bending over at the waist at 45 degrees. We have 128 degrees of knee bend, or 125 to 130, between tailbone to kneecap to back of heels. Then we have 5 to 10 degrees of tilt this way. And now we are set up to essentially feel like we are in the right posture for this backswing. Now, from that same spot, we want to feel like we are grounded and pushing into the ground, right? So just like if you were getting ready to do like a hex bar squat, or you're getting ready to like pick up dumbbells, when you do that, you can feel like you're pushing into the ground. Now, the way that you could sense that in your setup is that if you were to visualize like you were going to take a piece of carpet in between your legs, right? And I'm standing on the mat, and then in my setup, I feel like I'm kind of taking the carpet and trying to spread it out, which will activate my thighs and my glutes a little bit. So in my setup, I'm pushing into the ground, right? And I'm feeling like I'm pushing the ground a little bit apart. And then from there, with my tilts, I'm now in a position to essentially engage in a shot, right? We want to be very athletic in our setup. And at the same time, we also don't want our setup to be very stagnant. So as I'm doing this stuff, right, like I'm constantly moving and I'm constantly shaking. I am not sitting here like a statue. That's never going to work, right? So now that we've established a good grip, right? So going through our grip, we can look at the other episodes of Stock Shot Club or Stock Shot Show. When we have our good grip, right, we have our good alignment where we're aiming our face, looking 40 feet left, then I'm setting up, and you can see that when I do this, if you guys were to pay attention to my lower back, as I set up here, I go face, look left. You can see one of my cues right there is basically to basically get into my setup, right? I don't want to be like this, so I'm basically putting into pelvic tilt and kind of rolling my tail under. And there's a ton of ways to work on this pelvic tilt and make it. It's really getting your abs to be engaged so that you're in a athletic and engaged position to create a lot of force and a lot of speed. But like I said, if we do not have a good posture, doing the other things in our swings becomes really, really hard because everything else is going to be a Band-Aid or like it's going to be a way to try to compensate for what we have going wrong at the beginning of the setup. So we need to make sure everyone can have a good setup. So we need to make sure that we own that in our golf setup, all right? So thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Stock Shot Show. We'll see you back here for the next episode as we continue to dive into the golf swing and everything that you need to build a stock shot. What if you could build your own stock shot in just 21 days and it was completely free? Well, now, if you go to stockshotchallenge.com, you can do exactly that. Head over to the website and start building your stock shot in just 21 days.